All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are here with some of the authors from the special edition of the Foundation Review on SDGs. We're going to be talking about community leadership and the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. For those of us who are unfamiliar with the Johnson Center or new to the Johnson Center, we aim to be a global leader in helping individuals and organizations understand, strengthen, and advance philanthropy, which results in a smart, adaptive sector that helps create strong and inclusive communities. As mentioned previously, this is the edition of the Foundation Review, edition 13.4. It was sponsored by the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation. And while we are featuring 3 of the articles that were included in this edition of the Foundation Review, we also have other articles that are included in that edition as well that you can access. My name is Emily Brenner. I'm a program associate here at the Johnson Center in Learning Services. I am the Zoom host for today. And then I'm also pleased to have Dr. Michael Layton here with me, who is the WK Kellogg Philanthropy Chair, who will be moderating and facilitating this session today. I'm going to turn it over to Michael.
Emily, thanks so much. It's always such a pleasure to work with you on these things. And it's a great honor and pleasure to have some of our wonderful colleagues who contributed to the special issue of the Foundation Review. And we'll be examining 3 of the articles out of 6 in the special edition, available at no cost online. And I would be remiss if I did not introduce our friends and partners at Comunalia. Comunalia is the Alliance of Mexican Community Foundations. We did a webinar in Spanish recently with one of the other authors who happens to be a professor from Spain. And it went so well that they have offered to provide simultaneous interpretation of the remaining webinars in the series that we're going to be doing this summer. So I'm going to just pass it over to Minerva Zamora so she can give some brief instructions about how to take advantage of that simultaneous translation. Minerva?
Gracias, Michael, and thank you to the Johnson Center. Yes, if you require interpretation into Spanish, you can go to the bottom and there should be a little globe that says interpretation. Hit that, pick your language, and I would suggest also choosing to silence the original audio. Entonces, muchas gracias a quienes nos acompañan y hablan español. Nos da mucha emoción estar ofreciendo esto con el Johnson Center. Para acceder a la interpretación, si van hasta abajo de su pantalla, hay un pequeño globo, y ahí escogen si lo quieren en inglés o en español, y les sugiero que seleccionen también silenciar el audio original para que puedan escuchar mejor. Gracias. Thank you.
Bueno, mil gracias, de verdad, y bienvenidas a todos sus compañeros desde México hasta más al sur. I will not torture our interpreter by continuing to speak in Spanish. Here just a brief overview of what we're going to do this afternoon. Please keep yourself on mute during the remarks. We love your questions. We welcome them via chat. I will pick up on those. And we're counting on that in the second half hour of this hour that we're going to be together to really fuel a discussion with the authors, to take full advantage of the fact that they're available and able to interact with you now. So we're going through our welcome and introductions. There'll be panel presentations. Each one of our papers, our authors will take about 8 to 10 minutes. Using some slides to highlight some of the key findings from their work. And then we'll have that moderated question and answer. And there your questions are invited, very, very welcome. And I'd really love to be able to call on you to voice your own questions if time and circumstance permits. If you are able to be on video, it's very welcome. It's sort of nice to see, even if the icons are kind of small on the screen, it's great to see that. If you're not in a position to be available, either due to connections or the place where you find yourself, that's absolutely fine. As I mentioned, we have 3 papers being presented. We're going to start with Katie Leone. And she's going to be talking about her experience working with Collaboratory in Southwest Florida. And her topic will be where to start, a tool for thinking about the SDGs and community foundation work. Next will be Dr. Aysegul Timur from Florida Gulf Coast University. Also worked with Collaboratory, our wonderful colleagues in Southwest Florida. A case study emphasizing the collective impact aspect of their work. So we have two complementary views of the same process from Collaboratory. And then we'll end up with our neighbors to the north and west from Minnesota, the West Central Initiative, Sarah Casey, Anna Wasescha, and Christa Otteson, who work together in the West Central Initiative, transformative power of the 2030 UN Sustainable Development Goals. So without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to Katie.
Thank you so much, appreciate it. Welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us today. As mentioned, my name is Katie Leone, and I was working with Collaboratory during the time for the work that was covered. I currently work still in philanthropy, but on the corporate side, I work as the Director of Corporate Social Responsibility at Hertz. So I'm excited for our conversation today, and I'm going to give you a brief overview of some of the learnings and kind of hopefully help you get started on what might feel like a bit of a daunting topic. Next slide, please. So I'm sure if you're on this call, you've likely seen these before. Maybe this is even what attracted you to this call. But before we dove in, I just wanted to take a moment where we could all just really clearly look at these very big, audacious goals for the world that every country around the world has agreed to working on collaboratively. And really, community foundations and philanthropy is an important partner in accomplishing and realizing these goals. Next slide, please. So if you're not familiar, and what I love about the goals is that, they're very data driven and it's very easy to track progress. So you might have also seen, and if you haven't, I highly recommend, the UN just put out their 2022 Sustainable Development Goal Update Report. It's really sad to see what all the global crises they've really caused us to backslide quite a bit on many of the goals. And so I think that just makes it even more important for us to work together and to take the lessons that we can learn from the scholarship you're going to hear from today. But at the highest level, these goals are indivisible. I never recommend that community foundations try to pick them apart and just work with one or the other. While that might work for certain industries or certain nonprofits even, I don't recommend that for community foundations who are focused comprehensively on quality of life and well-being in a community. I think they really are designed to help you harness those synergies and trade-offs between different things kind of going on within a community. And they really are an opportunity to turn vicious cycles into more virtuous loops. And the data-drivenness of them is kind of a bit what I'll go into next on the next slide. So in addition to, these big goals, right? No poverty, no hunger. All right, they sound really great, but then I'm a kind of like, how do you do that? Where do you get started, and how does that actually start to work? So in Southwest Florida, here through the work at Collaboratory, working with so many different partners throughout the 5-county region, right here in along the Gulf Coast and even inland a bit up to Lake Okeechobee. We started by creating a shared lexicon for the data, dialogue, and decisions that we needed to make together. And in our community, we used what used to be called the STAR Communities Framework, but what is now referred to as LEAD for Cities and Communities, as kind of our local translator. So you'll see if you read the reports that we track all of the different targets and outcomes, and there's certain thresholds that we want to see occur by 2030, and so we know whether or not we're moving forward or backsliding. But some of those targets and thresholds don't really feel relevant in every community. So you need to first start by figuring out how to make the SDGs real and relevant for your community. And the framework, and I'll show you some examples later of this is very high level, but kind of, how we got into the details and the weeds with this. I will say that the collaboratory causes that you see are we're kind of connected to the SDGs through this local lexicon and translator. And they're not the only one out there. You know, some communities are using the social determinants of health as a really good translator. So it kind of depends on what folks are familiar with and what is going to work. Next slide, please. And community foundations, there's so many different ways. So the you know, the SDGs are complex, and then you have a very complex organization that's working on so many different things, working with so many different stakeholders. You know, you're working with donors, you're working with nonprofits, you have to engage your board, you work with the government. So you take a complex topic and then you try to overlay it onto a complex ecosystem, and that can feel like trying to boil the ocean. And so I don't recommend that. I say take it one step at a time. So we developed this wheel, and I think if you put in the animations, you should be able to see I've circled a few of these that I'm going to go through. If you click, I think it'll, yeah, perfect. So I'm going to kind of start at collective impact without stealing too much of Dr. Timur's thunder. She's going to go into that even more. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how we incorporated the SDGs into our grant making and community impact efforts, our work with nonprofits, and our work with donors and funders, just so you could really see how it looked like. So we took that local language, we took all the data and framework associated with those frameworks, and then we kind of took things step by step instead of doing them all at a time and overwhelming ourselves. Next slide, please. So again, on the collective impact side, this is mostly for you to see some of that insider baseball metrics and target sausage making, if you will. So we're lucky, and I'm sure Aysegul will talk more about this, we're lucky to have a fabulous collective impact initiative called Future Makers in our region that is really working to advance all of the SDGs that you see on the screen here. And again, so you take something like quality education, and you say, well, in my community, how do I know if I'm improving quality education? You can see that we look at this lead for cities and communities framework are the bold kind of things that can be tracked. And then the ones with the asterisks next to them are the ones that our community came together and said, these are the ones that we need to track. And Aysegul works to report out on these outcomes annually. So, you know, the framework is a starting place. As you can see, some of them we're not tracking annually, whereas others that weren't within the LEAD framework, we decided were so important that we needed to track them annually, such as FAFSA completion rates, because it's such a good indicator of so many other things. So I think you really, the moral of the story is, don't be inflexible. Make sure that when you're developing your logic models and your frameworks, that it is working for the folks in the community, and really make sure that you're partnering with those different groups to make sure that you're measuring and understanding if you're trending in the right or wrong direction, just like the UN does at a global level. Next slide, please. We also workshopped this with nonprofits. So through Collaboratory's grant making process, we wanted to make sure that the nonprofits knew how to speak this global language, because so many funders are asking nonprofits to align their work to these global standards. And we also believe that it could help them become more data-driven in developing their outcomes and their logic models for their grants. So this is just an example of a kind of workshop we did where we dove into the SDGs and, introduced them to the different lead for cities and communities outcomes and thresholds, and showed them, deep dive as to where they would find that data, in that last slide in that example, where you would go to find the census data, or what other stakeholders in the community were already collecting that data that you can maybe partner with to help yourself kind of track this over time. And that was so successful, next slide, that we thought, oh, sorry. I'm getting ahead of myself, as I'm wont to do when I get excited about topics like the SDGs. So I will say we also started reporting out to our board and to funders to kind of help them understand what causes where there was a lot of investment versus where there wasn't as much investment. So we saw this as an opportunity to start to bridge the work between what the nonprofits were doing and what the funders were interested in doing. So you see the grayed out causes, the ones that are not as bright. Those were causes that didn't receive any investment, I guess, if you will, that funding cycle. And that's for a variety of reasons. As many of you know, field of interest funds have language, and community foundations have to honor those donors' intentions. And so if you don't have monies that can be used for certain things, you don't have monies that can be used for certain things. So that's half of it. But then the other half of it was that through that coaching with nonprofits, we were focused on assessing impact and outcomes. So just because the environmental one is grayed out does not necessarily mean that we did not grant to an environmental organization that year. In fact, we did. However, their outcomes associated with their project were related to health and safety because they were an environmental organization that was using the money to do education to improve the water quality in an area that had been negatively impacted by some brownfields historically. So the outcome of their work was a health and safety outcome, although they were an environmental organization. So you could see there a very concrete example as to how this can be meaningful for nonprofits to have this aha moment where they start to understand that even though they are a nonprofit that exists for the environment, that they might be able to partner with their local health organizations and really move the needle in other ways. Next slide, please. This is just the same grant cycle illustrated by SDGs. So it's nice to be able, like I said, the SDGs are like a global language, so you can kind of translate things back and forth in your local language. In our case here in Southwest Florida, it was those causes, and also up to the SDGs at a global level. Next slide, please. And we did engage our donors in this process. We saw as a next step, we saw that we were donating more money through donor advised funds than our field of interest funds grant cycle. So that was the next obvious step for us to take. Again, these things happen sequentially. We didn't do it all at once and boil the ocean. And this was really a useful process. We worked with University of Michigan School of Information students over many summer and study abroad, study programs to assess our donor advised funds awards that were given over a 4-year period of time. And that was really impactful because then we started to have conversations about, okay, if we have certain funds that donors who are giving to nonprofits that aren't at all aligned to the SDGs, perhaps even antithetical to the SDGs, how do we start to have meaningful conversations with them? Or how do we have policies, a donor policy around encouraging donor advised funds to go to things that are leveraging the SDGs? Next slide, please. And this is, again, so we had it in our causes, and then we had it over to the by SDG, so the local back to the global. We could see where we had significant donor investment and where there's areas where there's not a lot of attention from donors, so that we could think strategically about how we build that anticipation and desire from donors to invest in these causes and do the right storytelling around them and spotlight the nonprofits doing the work. Next slide, please. So we also tried to improve the donor journey through this work. So we started to think of how we could bring donors along. How do we take a complex subject and make it more bite-sized for donors from the beginning of when they first engage with Collaboratory, or later on, existing longtime donors, how do we help them understand their impact even better? And then how do we have ongoing communications with them around the SDGs that they are interested in working with? And then the final slide shows you how we were thinking about improving the donor experience in their donor portal with the SDGs. So, instead of donors just being able to see transactionally where their money was, how their money was invested, they could see the impact by SDG as to where their money was invested. And that was something that we were continuing to build out. And that is a very high level view. And I look forward to taking questions at the end. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Katie. I just want to highlight and refer people to the article. The little diagram that Katie started off with is referred to as a point of entry wheel. And that's an interesting way of looking at how you invite people in and encourage them to join in thinking about and using the SDGs. But what is the point of entry between the measurement and various stakeholders? And so the kinds of tools that are highlighted in the article that the Collaboratory have developed are very useful. So let's move on to Aysegul Timur, Dr. Timur from Florida Gulf Coast University. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you so much for having us and to talk about our results and share our experiences with the audience. So thank you for the opportunity. Okay, so what I will do is that I will share with you a case study from Southwest Florida, a kind of continuation from what Katie mentioned in terms of SDGs and how collective impact initiative in Southwest Florida correlated with SDGs. So let's move to the next slide. All right, so usually I get started saying, I'm a future maker. What does that mean? Well, it's as part of our collective impact initiative, it is so important to share your excitement with everyone. So that's why I am so proud to say, yes, I am Vice President and Vice Provost at Florida Gulf Coast University, but I am also a future maker. That means you're part of the collective impact initiative in Southwest Florida. That is the Future Makers Coalition. So, but more importantly, we all believe, all the future makers believe that we have the collaborative focus on systems change. So we care about our community and we are part of that systems change. Well, if you are a future maker, means that you are part of the audacious community level goal in Southwest Florida. But that's not enough. So if with that audacious goal for our region, we think globally and we act locally. I think now you're understanding what Katie mentioned about, taking your SDGs as a North Star, and then you're translating into your local indicators and local commitment. That is our collective impact initiative. Think globally and act locally. But important point with that is really untangling those systems changes. So what is our goal? So Future Makers' goal is to increase the percentage of working age adults in Southwest Florida who have the credentials needed to fill jobs from 39% in 2013 to 55% by 2025. So Future Makers Coalition combines three important elements while we are moving toward this goal. Means that we have the blueprint of Sustainable Development Goals, which I'm going to quickly mention that. This is a collective impact model. You're part of it. We have a system for that, but also we have an implementation of what we call the CivicLab stakeholder engagement process. It's a systematic approach. So I'm going to talk about that in a bit, but why we are combining all these things? Because it is to change relationships in order to achieve local outcomes that are aligned with the global goals. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So in order to do that, you need support. You need backbone support. And what is that? That is where you see Collaboratory, formerly known, or our former name is the Southwest Florida Community Foundation, providing that support, backbone support to the Future Makers Coalition, but at the same time using the SDGs to design the collective impact initiative. Now it is growing up. It is almost 7 years old. So one thing is that throughout this case study, and I'm sure when you have been reading the article, you see the role of the community foundation here, in this case, the Collaboratory, playing a role guiding and facilitating systems change. So that is very important to note here. Okay, let's move to the next slide. All right, so we talk about Southwest Florida and this collective impact initiative, and then we're talking about Future Makers goals, 55%, but how do you relate this to Southwest Florida? Well, let me give you just a quick background of Southwest Florida. So we are a 5-county region. So it is a Collier County, Lee County, and Charlotte County. Those are the coastal counties, and then we have the inland counties, Glades and Hampton. Hendry County. Approximately 1.4 million population, but with the beautiful weather and the beautiful beaches, our DNA, our economic and social environment is based on tourism and hospitality, and of course, retirement community. So our economy is around retail trade, accommodation, and food services, healthcare, and construction. But when you look at the entire structure, more than 90% of the businesses are small businesses with less than 25 FTEs. So the workforce and the talent development is very important in our region, and we're competing with metropolitan areas of Tampa and Miami, and having challenges to attract new businesses and large organizations and diversification of the economy for Southwest Florida. So now you can relate to our audacious goal, why we have been saying, we need improvements in terms of the workforce development. So, and recently, Florida College Access Network has done a study, and we know that we need at least 60% of the credentialed individuals to take the jobs in our region. So that's why our goal is related to a lot of big picture things in our region. Let's go to the next slide, please. So how did we begin? I think, again, Katie gave you the big picture of the Collaboratory and Collaboratory's commitment to workforce and economic development. So next slide, please. And so we kind of renewed our commitment to regional focus on education and economic development, but again, aligned with the corresponding SDGs in our region, started around 2014. So at the same time, there were a lot of parallel things happening. Our local government's commitment, also measurement of the sustainability in our region, but Collaboratory took the lead on implementing that regional language, but aligning with the global goals. Next slide, please. So in that picture, this is actually our translation table. So putting everything into a simple perspective, we take the 3 SDGs, as you can see, to focus on. Number 4, quality education. Number 8, decent work and economic growth. And number 10, reduce inequalities. And then you can see first align with our, translation to STAR community ratings in terms of the assessments, and then really relating to our collaboratories and the Future Makers Coalition's collective impact, education, economy and jobs, and equity and empowerment. So next slide, please. So, but in order to do all these things, you need a local language, a common agenda, and shared measurement. So it's so important. And I think throughout the case study, you're going to see the evidence that having a local language and indicators to translate to the SDGs to align with the community needs is extremely helpful in developing a common agenda and shared measurements. Next slide, please. So how do you develop a common agenda? So this is the part so important that you really need to be systematic. And so that's where we are very proud of the implementation of the CivicLab's, the stakeholder engagement process. What is it? It is a rigorous and transparent methodology of multi-sector collaboration. So it's based on relationships. It's based on system building approach to address complex social challenges and opportunities. But here's the key: by redesigning the way people work together. How? So next slide, let's see this one systematically. I think this is kind of, not only a kind of stakeholder engagement process for me, this is how I'm approaching every single problem in my personal and professional life right now. So when you identified an issue, a community issue that is large, complex, what do you need to do? First, you need to identify the way that the stakeholders, who are the stakeholders that you want to involve and work with you. That's very important. So you take the component here, who you want to, who you need to have it at the same table to work on the problem, identify the problem, and then you need to really ask the question, why? Why do you think it is a problem? But then, as Katie mentioned at that point, the data is so important. You need to understand the voices and our data and create that common language. And then kind of, once you understand, then you need to start creating projects to address what is it, and then try to get really short-term solutions and complete with that. So as you can see, it is the big picture. Now, let's move to the next slide very quickly. From here, you engage with participants, you practice this. These are the examples to let you know that it is very practical. Actually, you work with these quick things, the Post-its. Next slide, please. And then at the end, you're very proud of, putting the big picture together, identify these areas. And next slide is going to tell you how we are continuing on these relationships. So I'm almost out of time, but I just want to spend 30 seconds on this. So we talk about the relationships, the collaborative structure. I know that this slide kind of very complex, but you can see that you build interrelated relationships here across the board. Next slide, please. It is practical, and I can tell you that as I am part of the Future Makers Coalition, and in this model, I am leading the FGCU, Florida Gulf Coast University's project team. As you can see, we work with a lot of people together building those relationships. Next slide, please. So with that, it is so important that changing the way we relate and work together, it is one of the important points. It's the strength for the coalition, and this is how we achieve the SDGs and the collective impact goals. Next slide, please. So you may say, okay, Dr. Timur, you talk about all these things, but tell us some results. Do you think that for Future Makers Coalitions moving the sustainability needle? Definitely yes, and you can see the evidence that we provided in the paper. We can see the improvements, especially for those outcomes that align with the coalition's goals. So finally, at the end, the next slide is, I want to say that Future Makers Coalition is a kind of example to show you the correlation between SDGs and translating the language to the local goals and work in the community together. Thank you so much.
Dr. Timur, thanks so very much. And what you really see there, and I'm going to just try to summarize what is difficult to summarize very quickly. It's how do you get people together? You need a process to guide them. You need a backbone organization to provide the structure to do it. And you need a shared understanding and agenda. And I think her article, as demonstrated in her presentation, Dr. Timur does a lovely job of putting those key elements together. And now we're going to shift from Florida to Minnesota, another initiative that takes in various counties, very diverse communities in a sense. And I'd like to pass it on. I think Sarah's going to kick us off from West Central Initiative.
Actually, Anna's going to kick us off.
Anna? Okay, sorry.
Mm-hmm. Anna, you're on mute.
Anna, you're muted.
I can't believe that. That's a rookie mistake. 2.5, 3 years into being on Zoom all the time. Thank you for telling me that. So first of all, thank you for inviting us. And I was saying to myself, apparently, that I've so enjoyed the conversation about what the Collaboratory has been doing and what you did with them, Dr. Timur, that I have to like shift gears now and think about the article we wrote and try to set it into a context that maybe would be of interest to the group. So if you would put our first slide up, Emily, I want to say that we began this process as a strategic planning process. And in the when we turned the corner into this new fiscal year on July 1st, only 2 weeks ago, we started our 4th year of having our mission and our framework within the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. So when we submitted the article, which was about a year ago this time, we described how it was that we found that what we were doing fit so perfectly within the schema of the SDGs that we wanted to adopt them, and we needed to get our organization into a place where we could think about, talk about, and then act on our good work as a community foundation. And we are also a regional planning organization. So those two kind of sides of our house work together within the framework of the SDGs. Since then, of course, since we wrote the article and since we embarked on this journey of being thinking about and tying our work to the Sustainable Development Goals, we've learned a lot. And so what we thought we would do today is each of us would take 2 things, sort of takeaways from our experience with the SDGs. But now I have to say, it was so interesting, Dr. Timur, that you said 1.4 million people and coastal Florida, Southwest coastal Florida, we are in the Middle West of the Middle West. So if you think of Minnesota as the northern plains, and we're in the Middle West of that part of the state, and there are 237,000 people in an area that maybe geographically is similar to yours, but rural and far less densely populated. So our first slide here, which I wanted to talk about, has to do with paying attention to the environment and to signs and symbols. So I would say in my role as the president of a community foundation, my focus is on communicating mental pictures that are so compelling they can shift people's view of the world. So my takeaways after several years with the SDGs are somewhat abstract. So first I want to say that foundations are platforms for civic participation. That may seem really obvious, but it's worth repeating. We are working in our communities to change something for the good. And it's what the Jews call tikkun olam, repairing the world. And I think in the US and in our region here in Minnesota, if asked what stands out about our world, people in my communities would say that we are deeply divided. To color that in a little bit, from a rural Minnesota perspective, we're deeply divided urban and rural. We're deeply divided between embracing anything new versus trying very hard to conserve traditional values, to go back to old ways of living together. As one of my colleagues said this morning, to go back to a time when we knew everybody's name in our community. And we're deeply divided politically, with red being much more prominent than blue in rural Minnesota. So when I think about this, it always reminds me of the Tower of Babel. Human beings in that story, you may remember it, human beings are getting out ahead of themselves and sort of thinking that they could do what God did. And so God punished them by making them all speak different languages. What better way to stop people cooperating with each other than to throw them into language turmoil? So the beautiful thing and the useful thing about the SDGs for us has been that they give us a common language. We can speak to our neighbors and we can speak to people all around the world, because we have 17 concepts in our mind's eye, all with identical icons, no matter the specific language. We crave unity, and that unites us. My message to our stakeholders is this: the SDGs are a global movement mobilized against an existential threat. We can do so much locally to help repair the world. It's our job, so let's do it. And as regards the signs and symbols, actually, I think that what I would say about that is that many of you have probably seen bumper stickers on cars that say, "Start seeing motorcycles." Once you start looking for signs that your community believes in global warming, they get climate change, and they're involved in the movement, you start seeing those signs everywhere. And because our time is short, I won't start listing them off, but mentally, if you would just start to tick off in your own mind the things that you see that have changed in the last 10, 15 years, because people understand the climate is changing. So my next slide, if you could switch it, I'll be much briefer here. The old saw was think global and act local, which Dr. Timur, you had, and that was so wise. That was such good advice. Rural Minnesotans might ask what these global goals have to do with us, and the answer is everything. Planet Earth is not divided into regions that are global and others that are labeled local. We are literally all in this together. And I think for those of you in the audience who are involved with community foundations, that's an important message that we need to communicate, that we're all local, we're all global. And although it doesn't need saying in this group of people, the SDGs exemplify how we are all interdependent by showing us the 17 elements of a planetary community that need to work together for everyone and everything, or it doesn't work at all. It's all one large ecosystem currently ailing pretty badly, and we have the opportunity to do something. So in our case, it's a call to our foundation to act. And it comes with the admonition that if we want to rise to this challenge, we must be integrative thinkers. Now I'm going to pass the microphone over to my colleague, Sarah Casey.
All right, thank you, Anna. So my first suggested tactic is to weave the goals into your communications. In our state and in our region, the SDGs are still generally a new concept. So we've made it really part of our communications mission to do our part in normalizing them. And so I'm just going to share with you just a few of the tactics that we're implementing probably in like a 6-month time period. Earlier this year, we launched our 2021 annual review. And in that publication, we tied every article, every story to one or more of the SDGs. We've heard really positive feedback, both from our internal team and from external sources. It really helps, our team to kind of align their daily work to like a global mission, which is really powerful. Second, this is kind of a fun tactic, but we've created a set of SDG yard signs, which seems like a really simple concept, but we are toting them around our region to different picnics, to different events. And I wish I had a picture of it, because 20 yard signs in one small space is a really powerful message. And so I think we're getting a lot of traction in that realm. We've also ordered hundreds of the SDG pins, those cute little, like on the screen, the little pinwheel thing that we are going to be distributing to our staff members, to our board members, and to our partners across the region, with the hope that they will wear them with pride when they're out at a soccer game, at the grocery store, and hopefully that will spark some conversation and definitely build awareness. And then finally, this August, we will be hosting a Lead for Minnesota Fellow whose sole mission for 12 months is really raising awareness of SDG 13 climate action through newsletters, through media outreach, and through other community outreach. So those are just some of the ways that we're promoting the SDGs in our region. But the more we weave the SDGs into our communications, both verbally and graphically, the more we're raising the profile of the goals and really furthering our collective work. So, next slide, please. All right, seek and embrace partnerships. So as stewards of the SDGs, we know that SDG 17 partnerships for the goals is vital. To achieve any one of the goals, we need cross-sector, cross-country collaboration. So I can share with you that since the article that we drafted was released, we've had different organizations across the country, internationally, reach out to us to learn more about what we're doing, where we're headed, and maybe we could identify potential ways that we could collaborate. Similarly, we want to continue learning and growing as an organization, so we've been doing a lot of outreach as well. In fact, we even sent two people, myself included, to a 17 rooms exercise hosted by the Central Florida Foundation to learn all we could about that exercise, with the hope that we could bring that SDG Center exercise back to Minnesota and kind of replicate it and learn from it. So in all, let's continue learning from each other like we're doing right now, and creating those strong partnerships within our states, within our regions, and just internationally to really hopefully reach these goals. So with that, I'll pass it on to Christa.
So before I talk about centering sustainability and equity, I just want to add like one community. So I'm a consultant and I do a lot of strategic planning, and that's how I came to this work with West Central Initiative. We brought the Sustainable Development Goals into their participatory planning process really near the end of their planning process in 2017-18. And I just wanted to share with you this really great, very tactile way of communicating about the SDGs that Rebecca Peterson, WCI's development director, had made up. And it's a placemat. Oh, sorry, I'm blurred. But she made up a placemat that she could take with on her visits with donors. And especially, I think, maybe some older people that she was talking with, it was very helpful for them to have this displayed, and the relationship between organizational frameworks and kind of more local priorities and these global priorities. And so I think that's such a great communications tool that's very, it's great for Luddites like me. So I want to talk a little bit about just two key tips that we've learned. We just finished the second strategic planning process that involved the Sustainable Development Goals. And so I just want to talk about a couple of things we learned. A very key thing that we want people to know that we've learned about the SDGs is their power to center sustainability and equity for an organization. And when you bring the SDGs into your work, you are centering sustainability and equity, and don't be afraid of using that language. So after working with the SDGs for a few years and integrating them into 2 consecutive strategic plans, I think my colleagues at West Central Initiative would probably agree that the SDGs will help philanthropy foster a sustainable and equitable world. And we were talking about how it's almost like neurons firing around the planet and sort of like firing up our collective consciousness and goodwill. And that's how we see the SDGs working in philanthropy, but also in the fields of regional and community development. And that's kind of the intersection where West Central Initiative lives. Next slide, please. And then finally, we want to encourage adopters of the SDGs to stay the course. As Anna mentioned, and as I mentioned, we initially brought the SDGs into their strategic plan. And it took a while for them to kind of, catch with staff internally. There's a lot packed into the SDGs. There's a lot of mileage. Don't jump ship too soon. So I imagine that the SDGs are going to keep showing up in one way or another in West Central Initiative strategic plan for potentially years to come. In some ways, the SDGs represent like a consciousness shift and a culture shift for the organization. And that isn't a short-term endeavor. So I've worked with a lot of organizations that generally want to completely redraft a strategic plan every 3 to 5 years, right? And like it's all new stuff and we're kind of starting from scratch. And it was very powerful to hear staff say, we are just getting started with the SDGs. We are not ready to move away from these. And so instead, the second strategic planning process gave us the opportunity to really delve more deeply into what the SDGs mean for the region and what they mean for the organization in terms of the organization's purpose, strategy, and maybe even more importantly, the identity of the organization and the people who are working to power it. And so we just want to make sure that folks know that this is this can be a long-term fuel for your mission, very powerful. And then keep in mind that I think we've seen really great evidence of this today in the earlier two presentations, but using the framework and integrating it with other frameworks and models. West Central Initiative is also in the field of regional and community development. And so there are a lot of different frameworks that we're working with here, and kind of overlaying the SDGs and integrating them with other sets of priorities that are expressed by the community is a way of both affirming the SDGs, but also really tethering the SDGs to local expressed needs and interests. And then lastly, I just want to say, don't expect everyone to click with the SDGs right away. It's going to take a while for some staff to feel comfortable with this really complex framework. I don't know, there are the 17 SDGs, but then there are also a lot of metrics tied into the SDGs. And so I think probably what happened with West Central Initiative over the first 3 years was it took a while to release the expectation that in order to talk about this framework, you needed to be an expert on it. And instead, for staff and board members to understand that really it's about the spirit of the Sustainable Development Goals and the spirit of collaborating, working in partnership, as Sarah mentioned, and really like connecting your efforts to data. And that's all we have for you today. So we'll move on to the Q&A portion. Thank you so much for your time.
Great. Thanks so much, Christa, and all our friends from Minnesota for that. And that the centrality of finding a common language, overcoming the Tower of Babel, and through symbols and engagement and things like placemats and yard signs. This doesn't have to be esoteric. It doesn't have to be rocket science. Human communication at its best boils down to some simple connections. So I'm very grateful for that very positive message. I would be remiss if I didn't give a plug to our upcoming webinar with the one and only Sandy Dahl from the Central Florida, the Foundation for Central Florida. I'm going to put that in the chat if I can figure out how to use my computer. There we go. So that's coming up in a couple of weeks. And as a number of people have alluded to, I think what we've had on this panel today are some of the community foundations who are at the forefront of figuring out how to implement the SDGs and translating something that it seems like a mandate from the UN that is heavy and burdensome and esoteric and unrealistic, and translating it into terms that get people excited, engage people in conversation, and get people moving towards measurable goals that they can then translate and connect with global transformation. And that's a really exciting process. I think we've experienced some of that today in the course of these presentations. I've been doing my best to try to monitor the conversation and the questions in the chat. And I saw a question from Gerardo Martinez, and I'm not quite sure how to formulate it, how you want to engage with one particular paper, Gerardo, but if you want to go off mute and ask your question, please feel encouraged. And Gerardo, I'm not hearing you. So, all right, I'll hold the space for you, but I see Emma Cawley just popped a question to the chat. When you add the SDGs to your donor portal and enable donors to see the impact they were having on different SDGs, did you find that it appeals to existing donors, donors who might not necessarily link community foundations to this global approach? And now I'm not remembering who it was that talked about that.
That was me.
Was it Katie? Yeah, Katie. Okay.
So
that was the last projects before I left Collaboratory. So I didn't have it sounds like someone else talking. Can you hear me? Yeah, and so that was one of the last things that we did with the ocean. We kind of took things one at a time. We were still like working on the prototype that you saw on this slide. But we're working to integrate it into our donor portal and to also, you know, think about it too, the grant making. We were also thinking about how to move more towards trust-based philanthropy, where we could, instead of having nonprofits, how could we instead assess their nonprofit and identify who's doing what work aligned to what things and who wouldn't find us otherwise, because, you know, as some presenters talked about, we have to think about equity and how to center equity in this work. And, you know, the people who have found you for the past 25, 50 years might not be, you know, the same folks you need to work with today. There's been groups that have been, you know, left out, and how do you make sure? I do think it was a useful tool with donors, though, to get them to think about permanence and perpetuity, and how to think about things in, you know, working with field of interest funds. Sometimes you read fund language and you're like, oh, that's antiquated words. How do you know, how would people even apply that today? And so to get them to think bigger and broader and think about how challenges might change over time, and to think about aligning at a really high level SDG, and instead of getting too prescriptive and in the weeds, so that way that the funds can be used to meet future needs that we might not anticipate in today's world.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Katie. And I think that really resonates as a big concern. And for me, it was one of the parts in Katie's article that was particularly interesting, because I think community foundations are very conscious of wanting to engage donors, educate donors, and motivate donors to think not just in their maybe idiosyncratic aspects of justice, which is absolutely lovely, but think about a shared agenda. That means the real strength and added value of a community foundation, of being a collective decision-making body that moves the community forward towards mutually agreed upon goals. And we are just about out of time. So I think our last petition will be, you will shortly get an email inviting you to do an evaluation session. Delighted to see that we had upwards of 35 people engaged. I'm so grateful to all of our panelists for sharing not only their knowledge, but their enthusiasm and passion for what to do in this hour. So thanks very much. I encourage you to look at Foundation Review. Come see us in a couple of weeks when Sandy Dahl is sharing her work in Central Florida. And we'll be back also in August on the 25th with an organization called Welcoming America, which is using the SDGs network community foundations and work with migrants, new Americans in our country. So that's exciting coming up. So please look forward to seeing you there. Thank you.